All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about cells again, and also talk a little bit about the origin of life, or at least some potential ideas behind that. This picture here shows you how much diversity cells can have. And this is just the beginning of all the diversity of cells. You remember, cells are the building blocks of life, or our life actually. So a single cell can be a living organism. And so here you can see different types of cells. Cells that are, live individually, like this protus here. So that would be an organism and a cell. And then you can, of course, see things like this red blood cell here. These look like hyphae from cells that would be from like a fungi. These look like villi and microvilli. This looks like a nerve in the dendrites. This looks like obviously a big egg with sperm cells around it. And in some ways, a sperm or an egg is an organism by itself in the haploid state. So again, there's just lots of different cells. This looks like a type of bacterial cell here. So cells can be really diverse. And they, as far as we know, are on Earth, they are what is living. You have to be a cell, and cells come from other cells, as you remember from the cell theory. And so cells have made all these types of diversity that we see on Earth. And again, it helps to give us an idea that all these organisms are made up of cells. They all have DNA. The DNA works the same in all of them, suggesting that all these organisms are related to one another. Just to show some of the diversities, here's an interesting organism here called the anglerfish, where it has an appendage that helps to attract other fish or organisms for it to be attracted to the mouth of this anglerfish. That's why they call it anglers. This projection moves around and wiggles around, kind of simulating a lure or a bait if you were going to fish yourself, and then that attracts the hapless organism to its mouth to be fed upon. The interesting thing about these fish is some of the species, there's about 150 something species that are known species. A small percentage, like around 12 or 13 or so, of these fish, the female is rather large, and the male ends up being a little parasitic fish that embeds in the female fish and essentially lives off of her while providing all the sperm that's needed to fertilize her eggs. So it's incredibly interesting life history that you don't normally think about from the perspective of, the fact that we have two sexes, and most animals that we would think about would have two sexes, but they do too, of course, but instead the male is a little parasitic fish that's embedded in it. So it's essentially just gonads for this fish. And so it kind of makes you kind of think, wait a minute, why would a designer do this? It makes more sense perhaps from an evolutionary perspective. Anyway, let's look at a little quick video about that. So here's a little bit of true facts about this anglerfish. Fair use education.
True facts about the anglerfish. The female anglerfish comes in many shapes, colors, and shades of ugly.
You can see how they all have that protrusion that functions as an attraction to bring some type of food in front of the mouth of this fish.
It's like a rainbow of ugly. The male anglerfish is tiny by comparison, like a tiny little baby.
Again, it's not true for every species of the anglerfish, but definitely an interesting percentage of them. And so here you can see the anglerfish, and then here's the little male that actually embeds its face into the female fish and then begins to just parasitically live on this fish and then basically becomes gonads for the fish, male gonads, and so fertilizes the eggs from the female.
He attaches himself to the female by biting her and then digesting part of his face so he fuses with her flesh.
So here's another little male, top of the female.
Then atrophies, losing his digestive organs, brain, heart, and eyes, and winds up nothing more than a pair of gonads, which release sperm when needed. Hey there, pretty lady. Nice gonads. To the female anglerfish, the human male is a very loud, annoying, and unnecessarily complicated pair of gonads.
Here's another.
The anglerfish is a master of disguise, hiding itself among the sand and rocks of the ocean floor.
So they're not all just deep sea either. There's lots of just in various levels of ocean. Here's a anglerfish in front of a flounder over here. Their mouths can actually distend and help to swallow another fish.
Here, an anglerfish compares its camouflaging skills with that of a flounder, also a master.
So you can see how the anglerfish has actually wrapped its jaws around a flounder over here. So the anglerfish is able to open its mouth, almost like maybe you probably thought about snakes being able to open up their jaws.
Holy crap, did you, what to hunt the anglerfish?
So here's that little protrusion that's now can be a lure for various species it'll eat.
Waves things in front of its mouth that its prey is attracted to. Here, the anglerfish waves a lovely pashmina shawl, just the size for an unsuspecting shrimp. Here, another one presents a lovely
So you can see that looks like a worm there being angled.
Pair of leggings. And here, a decorative hat feather. Sadly, the shrimps and their vanity pay the ultimate price.
Even looks like a shrimp if you look at this. It kind of does to me. No, I don't know if that's what's causing the shrimp to be attractive, but it does look like something the shrimp is at least interested in, whether it's eating it or sexually. It's interesting that it's attractive to it.
Yeah.
Of course, that results in it being eaten. And then there are those deep sea anglers too that have bioluminescent bacteria that live in the probe.
The fish collects glowy bacteria in its wavy thing to create a tiny little light, because it's dark as hell down there.
And that light can be a lure then for other things that'll eat down in the deep sea.
And someone needs to light up that pretty lady.
Anyway, so that's, of course, there's a lot of other videos that'll give you more information on the deep, or on the anglerfish and the various varieties of them. All right, so here's the evolutionary tree of life, and the idea is what evolution has suggested and biologists have figured out is that essentially all life on Earth is related to one another, that it came from a common origin of cells that then diversified over time to make the incredible variety of living organisms. The reason why we have this kind of information is through lots of things like molecular biology, looking at the different genes. You can make a molecular clock. You can see how closely things are related. But let's say you're looking at a particular gene, and then you can compare that gene to another organism, and you can get an idea of the relatedness of it. We can also look at the fossil record and see things like, if you go back into, tons of layers down, you could do radioisotopic aging of those rocks, and you see that there's bacteria in those fossilized bacteria or cells, and gives you an idea of like, oh, but there was a time when all we had on Earth was cells. And then we look at different layers, and we start to see more complex cells, and then more complex small organisms, and then become even more complex over time till you get to the layers where, of course, the most recent living organisms like ourselves existed. The DNA in all these organisms functions the same way. So it gives us lots of evidence that everything's related to everything ultimately. And I don't know why that would be considered heresy to some religious scholars or something like that, because you could make the argument that a creator caused the origin of everything to be the same. And you would think that a creator could come up with evolutionary explanations for making things change. I don't know why it has to be so fixated for some people, but clearly evolution does exist. And so here we have the tree of life. The idea was that the earliest organisms would have been single-celled bacteria. So there'd be some type of common ancestral cells that existed billions of years ago. And then, then again, they go off on their own branches. Why do the bacteria exist, yet other things formed? Again, it's just because they go on their own little evolutionary tracks. They don't have to just be in one direction. So some cells that would have rose to bacteria also became arose for archaea and eukarya. Now remember, bacteria are prokaryotes. These include things like our E. coli and bacteria that can make us sick, or they decay things, all sorts of kind of bacteria out there. And then we have another specialized group of bacteria called archaea, and their cell walls are totally different. Archaea, remember, are our extremophiles that can live in extreme environments, extreme heat, extreme cold. They can live in like hot sulfur springs and things like that. Then we have eukarya, which are cells that have a true nucleus, true organelles. Hey, how's it going? So when you look at this tree of life, what you're seeing here, if you just think of it as the base of the tree would be the protocells, the earliest cells. Some of them specialized off into different types of bacteria or archaebacteria, or protists, which we start to see eukaryotic cells. Remember, we're going to have endosymbiosis. The idea was that a bigger cell swallowed either mitochondria and or bacteria that would become mitochondria, or bacteria that would become chloroplast. So then we start to see protists that are functioning like a colony. And so this is kind of the precursor to multicellular organisms. And then the branching off, some become land plants, some become fungi, and then some become follow the animal lineage, that kingdom. And of course, then we can see branching, some become invertebrates. Actually, the vast majority of animals are invertebrates. And then we can see that the vertebrate lineage then becomes these various types of vertebrates. Now, I realize when I'm telling you this, I'm keeping it super simplified. There's lots of incredible amounts of evidence looking at DNA, looking at the anatomies of organisms, and people that have spent their entire lives, hundreds of people, thousands of people, scientists spending their lives putting this tree of life together. So it's not just something that just came up as a simple idea overnight. This is something that's been going on and studied for decades upon decades, hundreds of thousands of years, not hundreds, excuse me, literally hundreds of years. So maybe I sound a little silly, but obviously the tree of life has taken place over billions of years, but humans have been studying them as scientists. It would be initially starting off as natural scientists, where not very much of ideas are out there. And then we come to modern science, where we can look at the DNA, look at the genomes, look at the anatomy and fossils and all sorts of things. And we really start to put this and piece this all together. When we look at genes, we can see the similarities of organisms. If you were looking at different bird species, for instance, you could tell that a songbird, like a cardinal, would be more related to another songbird than, let's say, an eagle. And then if you look at the DNA, it's more similar too. So there's a lot of reasoning and evidence that goes into this idea of the evolutionary tree of life. Let's see if I can provide you a little bit more information. Okay, so now I'm going to show a little bit from this video on the tree of life for educational purposes. One of the most famous people to popularize ideas of biology and science in general is David Attenborough. He's made a lot of documentaries that you may have come across yourself. Anyway, he's going to describe a little bit about the tree of life here.
150 years after the publication of Darwin's revolutionary book, modern genetics has confirmed its fundamental truth. All life is related. And it enables us to construct with confidence the complex tree that represents the history of life. It began in the sea some 3,000 million years ago.
3,000 million years ago would be what, 3 billion years ago. We know a little bit about the idea of what the earth was like, and then after it cooled down and water was present on the surface, it would provide a medium for cells to live in. Cells, even in your body, live in water. You know, it's primarily water.
Complex chemical molecules began to clump together.
Now remember abiogenesis, we talked about that. I might mention a little bit more on this in a moment, about the idea that an early Earth's atmosphere would have had gases like methane and carbon dioxide and so forth, and then things like electricity, lightning could help transform these compounds into more complex biomolecules like precursors of amino acids or amino acids and so forth. And so the idea was that these early compounds came together, clumped together into something that was kind of a cellular ball of something like a phospholipid. And so essentially life is chemistry. We don't fully have all the answers, of course. We're still trying to figure things out, but more pieces are starting to be put together. So this is kind of a very general idea of how life history on Earth would have taken place.
To form microscopic blobs, cells. These were the seeds from which the tree of life developed. They were able to split, replicating themselves as bacteria. And as time passed, they diversified into different groups. Some remained attached to one another.
Remember, the first bacteria, then things like the common bacteria, then we'd also have the archaebacteria. Then we start to see the groups of cells that can kind of form colonies together. This would be our algae. We're starting to see chloroplasts. So a lot of things that maybe details are that we describe, like endosymbiosis. And I'll maybe show a video on that one, were included.
So that they formed chains. We know them today as algae. Others formed hollow balls which collapsed upon themselves, creating a body with an internal cavity. They were the first multi-celled organisms. Sponges are.
So you would have actually protists that would form these colonies. And then it led to, and they're going up the animal chain. So the most simple animals are actually sponges. Those are, as you probably know, in the bottom of the ocean.
Direct descendants. As more variations appeared, the tree of life grew and became more diverse. Some organisms became more mobile and developed a mouth that opened into a gut.
So again, they're clearly talking about the animal chain, the animal tree of life. There's obviously been a plant and the fungi and so forth.
Others had bodies stiffened by an internal rod.
So now they're talking about the vertebrate chain. So there's all sorts of invertebrates and other things that aren't mentioned. So this would be a notochord that would lead to the rise of vertebrate animals like ourselves. animals
They
with backbones.
understandably developed sensors around their front end.
So again, that would be starting to form the brains and the head region.
A related group had bodies that were divided into segments with little projections on either side that helped them to move around on the sea floor. Some of these segmented creatures developed hard protective skins, which gave their bodies some.
Keep in mind, these animals don't exist anymore. We see it in the fossil record. These animals existed before humans existed.
Rigidity. So now the seas were filled with a great variety of animals. And then around 450 million years ago, some of these armored creatures crawled up out of the water and ventured onto land. Here, the tree of life branched into a multitude of different species that exploited this new environment in all kinds of ways. One group of them developed elongated flaps on their backs, which over many generations.
So these became the invertebrates and insects and things like that.
Meanwhile, back in the seas, those creatures with a stiffening rod in their bodies had strengthened it by encasing it in bone. A skull developed with a hinge.
That means there's various types of animals that came on land. There were invertebrates like the insects, and then there'll be vertebrates that ultimately become reptiles or amphibians and reptiles and so forth.
The
mammals.
could grab and hold on to prey. They grew bigger.
So now we start to see a hinged jaw form on these primitive fish. Again, this is leading to the vertebrates that ultimately become ourselves.
Hold on to prey. They grew bigger and developed fins equipped with muscles that enabled them to swim with speed and power. So fish now dominated the water. One group of them developed the ability to gulp air from the water surface.
Again, they're real fossils of this animal found. It's not just people making up stuff. They've actually found this fossil.
Fleshy fins became weight-supporting legs, and 375 million years ago, a few of these backbone creatures followed the insects onto the land. They were amphibious with wet skins, and they had to return to water to lay their eggs. But some of their descendants evolved dry, scaly skins and broke their link with water by laying eggs with watertight shells. These creatures, the reptiles, were the ancestors of today's tortoises, snakes, lizards, and crocodiles. And of course, they included the group that back then would dominate the land, the dinosaurs.
I mean, again, that's dumbfounding to think people don't realize that we didn't exist when dinosaurs were running around. They weren't riding their backs or anything like that.
But 65 million years ago, a great disaster overtook the Earth.
So we went from 4 billion now to 65 million years from the present. Why do they think things like a meteor or a comet hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs? Is because they can look at the different soil, they can look and see crater areas and see the different layers change over and get an idea that this was where this would have been an impact in the dust flying in the air and stuff like that. It's stuff to me is amazing that the people have been able to figure this stuff out.
All the dinosaurs disappeared except for one branch whose scales had become modified into feathers. Maybe the bird.
And again, we have fossils like Archaeopteryx, We have fossils of Archaeopteryx, which is the dinosaur with teeth but with feathers. So that line becomes the modern bird line. Now you're thinking, well, what about T-Rex or something like that? Realize that's a different one. Things go in different evolutionary paths. That's why you can have birds and dinosaur or bird-like dinosaurs and then move up this other track.
While they spread through the skies, a small, seemingly insignificant group of survivors began to increase in numbers on the ground beneath.
Thanks to the dinosaurs being removed, mammals could then really begin to flourish. We call that adaptation, adaptive radiation.
These creatures differed from their competitors in that their bodies were warm and insulated with coats of fur. They were the first mammals. With much of the land left vacant after the Great Catastrophe, they now had their chance. Their warm, insulated bodies enabled them to be
Excuse me. So warm, furry bodies, that's mammals. That's us.
active at all times, at night, as well as during the day, and in all places, from the Arctic to the tropics, in water as well as on land, on grassy plains.
The idea is actually land mammals went back into the ocean, became things like whales and dolphins.
And up in the tropics. Groups that have evolved on this planet, birds, reptiles, with insects and with fish.
And the idea is all this stuff is all related to each other. Here's a little clip about David Attenborough's view on religion. Remember, as a scientist, we tend to follow the scientific method, which means what can we measure? What can we see? What can we feel, think? I mean, it's not enough for that. We have to, it's about measurements, and then we put together arguments. So we're like a detective collecting evidence. If we were at a crime scene, we weren't there at the crime scene, we were detectives collecting that evidence to put it together, make a good explanation of what we think happened at that crime scene. That's what we're doing here as scientists. We're collecting evidence. And again, it's not just one scientist, it's thousands of scientists spending their careers trying to put this together. And so again, it's nobody's ever going to know for sure. But we're collecting the evidence, trying to put together the arguments. David Attenborough, who again, he's a BBC famous presenter of scientific ideas. And so he shows the beauty of nature, but he also shows the brutality of nature. And if you're going to, maybe use a supernatural explanation, you have to take into account that nature is both beautiful and it's brutal. And so again, it's easy to sugarcoat it. I run into a lot of people that have almost a Disney mentality when it comes to things like animals and nature, and the idea that everything just loves everything, and predators are, then they have trouble dealing with the fact that things are predators that eat each other. You live on a planet where you have to eat something to survive, whether you're an omnivore or a carnivore, or even a herbivore. You're going to eat something and kill it. Even things that are famous herbivores like white-tailed deer will be seen eating a little baby deer or baby bird out in the woods. It's impossible to live on this planet without killing something. If you have a field of agriculture, you've harvested that field, you've planted and destroyed the animals that were in that soil. You clear cut that area to grow. So even if you're a vegan, you had to deal with the fact that that field killed lots of animals to grow that food. It's impossible to live on this planet without something dying. There's pathogens, there's all sorts of things that harm something. And you have to put that into account when you're trying to piece together your own philosophy and viewpoints about life and nature and so forth, and God or their creator. All this has to kind of be accounted for. You can't just collect one little evidence and sugarcoat it and put it together and fit what's happening in reality. And that's where he's going with this. Even our closest ancestor, living ancestor, let me put it a little bit differently, because we've had other human types that are no longer with us. They're extinct, like Neanderthals, Australopithecines, Homo erectus. There's all sorts of different hominids that are no longer alive. Our closest living ancestor then is chimpanzees, and chimpanzees have been seen hunting, killing monkeys and little antelopes and things like that for meat. So our ancestors and our cousins. So chimpanzees, let me make sure I make this very clear. The chimpanzee, we didn't evolve from chimpanzees, but we shared an ancestor, so we consider chimpanzees a cousin. The closest living relatives are now extinct, like Neanderthals and Homo erectus and things like that. So our closest living relatives are chimpanzees. About 98% of our genome is the same as theirs, and they hunt and eat meat. Now, maybe a relatively small amount, maybe 5% of their diet, 2%, 5% of their diet is hunting, but they definitely eat meat. They're not vegan. And they talk about gorillas. Gorillas is actually quite a bit more diverged than chimpanzees to us. The other thing to keep in mind is chimpanzees can actually be very brutal. They can be loving and caring, but they also can be brutal and have little warfares and tribal warfares with one another. Chimpanzees have also been seen to use tools. Chimpanzees may even have greater memories when it comes to like photographic memories. It seems like chimpanzees have a very strong photographic memory and understandings as well. It's reality, and it's important to be an adult to understand that, because the world is not a safe place. We know there's wars going on now between humans. I do think the Earth deserves to have chimpanzees, though. We got to protect our natural resources and as much life as possible. And I'm obviously very much in that belief also. All right, so we have some idea about the tree of life and how the diversity of life may have happened. Obviously, you can spend a lifetime studying that and still not know and fully understand. We live on the planet Earth, and as far as we know, that's the only planet that has life on it. We know that probably a planet with life on it should also have water and live in this Goldilocks zone. And so this is our 8 planets. We used to consider Pluto a planet. And here's the Earth. So it's 3 planets away from the sun. So we have Mercury, Venus, Earth. Earth appears to be in this Goldilocks zone. And even Mars is thought to have had water on it. And Venus has a lot of water vapor. I'm not an expert on all the different planets. And there's even a moon around Jupiter, that apparently have water as well. So water, at least as far as we know, is important for life. And so that's one of the things that we look for when we look at other planets outside of our solar system. And the idea is that this Goldilocks zone is also where we look for planets, because this is the distance from the sun that is most likely to have water and thus life. But most of the galaxy and the universe and solar system, as far as we know, does not have life. So life is and is kind of a rare thing. Now, that being said, because the universe is so vast, there's probably a reasonable probability when you consider the vastness of space and planets that life exists somewhere else as well. But we got to take care of this planet because this is the only place that we know of that we can exist along with all the other Earthlings that we're related to. At one time, the planet, when it was first being formed, was not livable. It would have been a hot, molting lava area when it first was formed. Because what happens is stars and galaxies, and we know that we have some idea of an expanding universe because we can use telescopes and see the far reaches of outer space, and we see galaxies moving away from each other. At one time, the Earth was not livable by the animals and critters and plants that live on it today. It was, again, the idea is the outer shell became cooled down, but at one time it was a hot planet. And then there's evidence that things like comets would hit the planet and help to form the oceans. And then the outer shell has cooled down. This is where life can exist, and then a small atmosphere around it that provides a mild greenhouse effect that helps to keep the surface water liquid. We do have extremes, though. We can have anywhere from a minus 100 degree Fahrenheit to 120 degree Fahrenheit at the different poles and the equators. And the Earth is spinning, the outside of near the equator is actually further from the sea floors than the poles are. Because when you spin, kind of spinning a pizza, the outer areas get flattened. And then we do have a tilt, 23-degree tilt to the Earth. And so when the Earth goes around the sun, obviously what's facing the sun, when the northern hemisphere is facing the sun, we have summer. When it faces away, we have winter. And then as time, the planet cooled down, we had those first cellular organisms that were able to convert the early Earth's atmosphere into one that had oxygen that allowed for cellular respiration and things like that. So again, the earliest Earth would have been a very inhospitable place for life. And we would have had hot, molten like lava floating in outer space, and then eventually cooled and had that cool crust. Asteroids and volcanoes were active. Again, we're still talking billions of years before the Earth first formed, which would be around 4+ billion years ago. Took about another billion years before the Earth was hospitable enough for the first cellular life to take place. As you saw from the tree of life, the first 4.5 to 5, first billion years, we wouldn't have seen life. And then we start to see chemical evolution taking place, which is where we talk about, and I'll mention it again, I know I said it in class, that abiogenesis, the idea that these biomolecules could be formed from early Earth's atmosphere through natural forces like lightning and stuff like that, allowing for the first cells to form. So then we're talking around 3.5 billion years ago, we start to see cellular life, just single cell life, changing the atmosphere through photosynthesis to the point where we start having oxygen in the air and allowing for more complex organisms to form, as described by that video. And if you look over here, you can actually flip this over if you wanted to follow it based on time. This would be around 3 billion years ago up here. And then we start to see the more complex organisms and cells around 2.5 billion years. And then we start to see even more. So this is flipped over. So this is from past to present. just like this is from past to present. So you can actually flip the slides and things like that, meaning if you wanted to get these two images to correspond. But remember, initially we would have had life on Earth. It would have been hot molten Earth. Earth cools down, comets and things like that help to form the oceans. We start to see cellular bacterial life, early cells, and then bacterial life and archaea existing. Then we have things like called endosymbiosis, where we talked about in class a little bit, where a cell swallows another cell, and then we have more complex eukaryote number of true cells, which then leads to, the colonies where we have algae, and then from there we form plants from the algae line, or from the animal line, you start to see fungi, animals, and so forth. Chemical evolution was the idea that the early Earth's atmosphere before life existed had been made up of things like water, methane, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and ammonia. And then through natural forces like lightning, temperatures on the planet, these compounds could join together to make our simple biomolecules, like simple amino acids and simple lipid-like structures and so forth. And then eventually the idea is that these complex compounds were formed into balls of lipids that became kind of our protocells. Yeah, we don't fully understand how that all happened, but we have some good ideas, but we don't fully know. And remember, these are amino acids that we talked about in a biochemical class in a couple lectures ago. Here we have methane, or excuse me, amino acid. This is a carboxyl side. This is an amino side. This is a carbon hydrogen. So this would be an example of a simple amino acid. Then we get more complex amino acids. The idea is that during this early Earth's atmosphere, these simple amino acid-like structures could be formed through just natural forces without necessarily needing a life form to make them. We also think a lot of early Earth and some of these extremophiles and things like that can live in and around hydrothermos and things like that, because it's releasing sulfur, and some bacteria can live on that without photosynthesis. So that kind of stuff happened before photosynthesis occurred. So life was possible even before photosynthesis occurred. And so it would happen around the hydrothermal vents. As you probably know, these hydrothermal vents are found throughout the ocean, and the red dots represent where they're located, forming plate tectonics. And so you can see how at one time the continents were joined together. It doesn't take much to see put the puzzle pieces together. Here you can see South America could fit with Africa and form a nice structure. You can see how Europe could fit in here in the Gulf of Mexico. This would actually, Australia would have been up here near India. So we call this Pangea when all the continents were joined together. It's studied, and apparently these continents can move from each other at a pace of about 1 fingernail length a year. So it takes hundreds of millions of years to move these continents around. And also we can see the animal life forms on these different planets, or excuse me, on these different continents. And it's through biogeography, you can see the distribution of animals. So we have like New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, and we have New World monkeys. There's different types of animals like that. Again, you can see how this would be a really interesting, fascinating thing to study on your own more. So here's some of the major events of the life history on Earth. Chemical evolution led to the appearance of life about 4 billion years ago. Initially, it would have just been these random inorganic chemical interactions and then the lightning and natural forces made these basic simple molecules that got enclosed into some type of simple cell that was able to replicate itself over time. Again, all the ways that happens is still not fully understood. And so we start to see the appearance of cells. So we have our abiotic, non-living synthesis of simple organic compounds. That's going to be that chemical evolution. And then we have monomers that become macromolecules like proteins and nucleic acids. And these macromolecules are able to replicate themselves. And then we start to see these primitive cells with a simple membrane around them. This was happening in this primordial soup of these hydrothermal vents providing energy for photosynthesis start taking place. You don't fully understand how life formed on Earth. But things like this and RNA, which is a self-replicating informational molecule, apparently was a presence. And things like liposomes, we can see those in water as well, which is basically a lipid bilayer. Remember how the lipid bilayer can be formed on its own like a bubble in soap and things like that. So RNA would have been trapped in these protocells and replication could have occurred. Again, we don't know for sure, and it takes a lot of studying and very smart people trying to figure this out, and we're learning more and more all the time. This isn't a dead area. This kind of stuff is constantly being improved upon as far as our understanding. So that led to the tree of life, as we described. We talked about cells already in the previous lecture, but this kind of gives you an idea of the scale of things. Here we have our finger or thumb, which is around 20 millimeters in length. If you looked at blood vessels, you'd see that's about 2 millimeters in length. And then we start to see cells and tissues as 0.2 millimeters in length. And an actual cell is around 20 micrometers in length. And a mitochondria is about 2 micrometers in length. And then we can start to see ribosomes and messenger RNA around 0.2 micrometers. So ribosome is actually around 20 nanometers. So then these are all smaller scales. You start to see molecules of atoms around 2 nanometers. And then actually see an atom, we're talking about 0.2 nanometers. So it gives you an idea of scale and how small things really get. Now remember, cells are small, and that has a lot to do with the surface area to volume ratio. The idea is that you want a small cell because the volume is substantially smaller, allowing for substances to move in and out of the cell and diffusion of gases and so forth. So the idea is that cells being small and increasing its surface area maximizes cellular metabolism. So it's important for cells to be small. If you have a large cell, there's like a basketball, the volume is so much greater than the surface area, it takes a lot longer for substances to leave and enter the cell. So again, the first life forms on Earth were very simple bacteria, and we study this again in the fossil record. So the earliest evidence of life in chemical signatures, microscopic filaments, and microbial mats were seen. And so this is an example of fossils of microbial mats found in Sweden. And so this gives us ideas of what early Earth looked like. We can do things like carbon dating and see the ages of these fossils. And so, here we can see microscopic filaments are found in hydrothermal vents deposited in Quebec. And so these are well-preserved fossils that are around 3.5 billion years ago. Again, these are people that really studied it and know what the heck they're talking about. So anyway, to go to my next or my previous lecture, when we talked about cell theory already, we have the first ideas of the cell through Robert Hooke, who looked at compartments in plant core tissue and called them cellular. You see Anton von Leeuwenhoek that had a very simple microscope. We see that Schindler and Schwann had some of the first statements on cell theory. I'm going to leave it here and you'll go look at the other presentation, but basically cell theory is that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. Cells are the smallest living things, and cells arise only by the division of previously existing cells. To keep that in mind, that's after cells formed. So if we have protocells running around now, they're most likely just going to be engulfed by cells that are currently living because they dominate the oceans now. So that's why I don't have these new cells forming all the time. Anyway, go back and check out the cell lecture if you'd like to know more about that. Let me leave you with the endosymbiotic theory. And that's this one right here. So this one's important too. So the endosymbiotic theory, it was the idea that the simplest cells were prokaryotes. Remember, they're just single cell, they're just DNA in them. Then around 2.1 billion years ago, eukaryotic cells were formed by prokaryotes. So basically we had a large bacterial cell that had lost its cell wall and engulfed a smaller bacterial cell that was able to live inside it. When they were able to live inside it, we call that symbiosis. And so some of those bacterial cells became mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria are going to have their own DNA and replicate inside your cell. Remember, mitochondria comes on the female lineage. So all the mitochondria in your body came from your mother, that came from her grandmother, that came from her great-grandmother. And it provides ATP. So the idea was that the big cell engulfed a little cell that could provide ATP and energy that ultimately made the big cell, work efficiently. Then some of those cells engulfed another cell that was photosynthetic, because remember, green is chlorophyll, and this led to chloroplast. And so we have some plants with mitochondria and chloroplast, and then we have our plants. And then we, of course, have the animal lineage and fungi that just have the mitochondria. And that's where cellular respiration takes place. This is why you breathe out carbon dioxide, because you break down sugar and make ATP. So again, the idea of endosymbiotic theory was that a big cell engulfed a smaller cell and formed a symbiotic relationship. And we call this the endosymbiotic theory. This was first proposed by Lynn Margulis, who came up with the idea back in 1970. And again, it's the idea that a large cell engulfed these small cells that could then replicate inside the bigger cell, becoming either mitochondria or chloroplasts, or both, depending on the type of plant, or in the case of animals, just mitochondria. So that's where the first ideas came up. We know things like photosynthesis is important. We already talked about this in another lecture about that. Let me show you a little bit more about the endosymbiotic theory. All right, so here's an animation that could help describe the endosymbiotic theory.
On its internal membrane system, called the endoplasmic reticulum, and the nuclear envelope may have evolved from infoldings of the plasma membrane in an ancestral prokaryotic cell.
Remember, these membranes are made of phospholipids.
Such infoldings are common in modern prokaryotic cells. The thick
or prokaryotic cells or bacteria and things like that.
Theory of endosymbiosis proposes that a critical stage in the evolution of eukaryotic cells involved endosymbiotic relationships with prokaryotic organisms. Microorganisms that live within other.
I heard the idea that some bacteria would have been engulfed, and this was happening through endocytosis, which is the idea of the cells engulfing, a phagocytosis, and then forming a symbiotic relationship. One thing you might not realize is when we talk about mitochondria, which is what this represents, you see a picture of an animal cell and you see a few mitochondria in there. The reality is that mitochondria can be all sorts of different shapes, and some of your cells are going to have a lot more mitochondria than another type. For example, heart muscle is going to have a lot more mitochondria in the liver than even skeletal muscle, or skin cells is going to have less. So cells that have a high demand for ATP is going to have more mitochondria.
Other cells and perform specific functions for their host cells are called endosymbionts. According to the theory, energy-producing bacteria may have been engulfed by a larger primitive cell and come to reside within it, eventually evolving into what we now know as mitochondria.
This is an electron microscope image of a mitochondria.
Photosynthetic bacteria use photosynthetic pigments embedded in internal membranes to derive energy from sunlight. These bacteria may have come to live within early eukaryotic cells, leading to the evolution of chloroplasts. Several facts provide evidence for the endosymbiotic hypothesis. A few examples include: 1. Mitochondria and chloroplasts contain their own circular DNA, similar
Remember, circular DNA is what we see in bacteria.
to DNA in bacteria. 2. Both mitochondria and chloroplasts are surrounded by two membranes. The inner membrane is probably evolved from the plasma membrane of the engulfed prokaryote, while the outer membrane is probably derived from the cell membrane of the host. 3. Mitochondria are about the same size as bacteria. 4. Mitochondria appear to have been derived from purple bacteria, and chloroplasts derived from photosynthetic bacteria.
There's Prochlorococcus, which apparently is the smallest, most abundant photosynthesizing cells in the ocean, and account for about 5% of the oxygen. Looking at the notes again, here's something that I didn't know a lot about. I guess I came to know a little bit more about it because of this class. But in addition to the endosymbiotic theory, you can have your primary endosymbiosis, where a larger cell had swallowed a smaller cell, like cyanobacteria. And, that could form the chloroplast and all the stuff we talked about. But apparently, you can have a eukaryotic cell get swallowed by another eukaryotic cell. And then, so basically, a larger cell can swallow another cell, like an algae or a green algae, and now it gets incorporated in it. So you can have like multiple endosymbiotics. And then, as I understand, this cell becomes the DNA in its nucleus gets degenerated or transferred over to the bigger cell's nucleus. So all sorts of complex things are occurring in this cellular mixture. And so they call that a secondary endosymbiosis. So the primary was when the little bacteria was swallowed by the big cell. But now we got a big cell being swallowed by an even bigger cell. And then that other cell then becomes incorporated into it. So that can happen with some of those photosynthetic things that we see, like the red and green algae. So it's really kind of crazy complex. And I don't necessarily need you to worry about that too much. Just realize a lot of these things apparently have occurred. and get incorporated into other cells. And I guess maybe it even happens in the salamander. So this is something I haven't really even studied or thought about much. And so here it's showing you that this big cell gets incorporated and then starts transferring some of its DNA, and then it becomes smaller over time. So there's all sorts of symbiotic kind of things going on. And like I said, I haven't even really studied about secondary endosymbiosis, or secondary endosymbiosis. I haven't even really studied or thought about that. So I just thought about that primary endosymbiosis, but apparently both of them can occur. We don't worry too much about that. If you were listening to my classes, we talked about the plasma membrane being made up of phospholipid bilayer, and that's what's needed to make the cell membranes, the nuclear membranes, all these different organelle membranes. We talked a lot about phospholipids in class, and hopefully you remember something about that. Be sure you study that. We have organelles like lysosomes, which are the digestive centers of cells and can cause intercellular digestion. They can break down and recycle substances that are in cells, so those are lysosomes. We also have peroxisomes that can make hydrogen peroxide and can be used for breaking down substances that can be found in high levels in livers and so forth. We have huge vacuoles in plants, which are meant for storing substances and for trigger pressure in plants, for water movement, and also can hold toxic chemicals. And then remember, cells can have a cytoskeleton. So they have something that's like your skeleton, but instead it's proteins that go through it. So this is where the nucleus is. We removed everything by the cytoskeleton, so you can see the cytoskeleton. Again, it's going to be this protein matrix that helps hold the organelles and so forth together, and it's important for mitosis. And then we have extracellular proteins that are helpful for communication and coordination. So make sure you study this chart also. This talks about the different types of organelles and what they do. So like the nucleus is important for DNA storage. Ribosomes are important for protein synthesis. Endoplasmic reticulum is important for protein folding and lipid synthesis. We have vesicles and Golgi apparatus does all sorts of sorting, and lysosomes are breaking down substances, and we have peroxisomes that are important for cellular respiration, mitochondria for energy production, and chloroplasts for photosynthesis. Anyway, make sure you study all those kind of things, and thank you for paying attention. Take care and have a good weekend. Bye.